Imagine for a moment that almost overnight, your city's local police force was just placed under direct federal control.
Yeah.
What would that immediate shift feel like? What would you wonder about, say, your daily commute, about who was really in charge of your neighborhood's safety?
Hmm.
And, what extraordinary circumstances could possibly lead to something like that? And unprecedented action.
Hmm.
Welcome to Global Politics Today. We are about to embark on a deep dive into an event that has not only, well, seized headlines, but has also ignited a fervent, often polarizing discussion about the very nature of power, the limits of local autonomy, and how we as a society actually define public safety.
Like a huge topic.
It really is. Our central focus today is the recent and highly contentious federal takeover of law enforcement right here in Washington, D.C., an action executed by a direct presidential order. Our mission with this deep dive is, I think, incredibly clear. We aim to peel back the layers of what actually transpired.
Get behind the headlines.
Exactly. To thoroughly explore the conflicting narratives and the competing justifications that quickly surfaced, and perhaps most importantly, to deeply consider the broader, far-reaching implications this event holds, for governance and public perception across the United States.
Hmm.
The ultimate goal is really to equip you, our listener, with the context and clarity needed to navigate the various viewpoints, to sift through what can often feel like just an overwhelming amount of information,
It can be overwhelming.
and ultimately to grasp the core issues at play in this incredibly significant and frankly complex moment in our political landscape. To do this, we'll be drawing on a range of highly credible sources. We're talking comprehensive reports from major news outlets like AP News, The Guardian, Reuters.
Standard, reliable sources.
Right, alongside incisive analyses from publications such as the Daily Beast. This diverse array of sources is crucial, we feel, to ensuring we provide a truly balanced and well-rounded exploration of both the undisputed facts and, importantly, the diverse perspectives surrounding them.
And what's truly fascinating here, and I think really crucial to understand right from the start, is that this is far from just some, localized incident confined to D.C.
Right, it has wider implications.
Absolutely. This event touches on some of the most fundamental questions about the balance of power, the kind of balance that underpins any functioning democracy, really. Throughout our conversation today, we're going to rigorously examine how official statements, from the highest office, appeared to clash quite starkly with the empirical data on the ground.
That data point is key.
It is. And how an almost immediate and palpable public outcry fundamentally challenged the administration's narrative. And, of course, what the potential long-term repercussions might be for the delicate fabric of federal-local relations across the entire nation.
So not just D.C.
Definitely not just D.C. Our aim is to provide you with a comprehensive, nuanced picture, allowing you the space to form your own well-informed conclusions about this undeniably complex and, well, pivotal situation.
Okay, so let's start by precisely setting the scene for this extraordinary sequence of events. Because the timeline and that initial declaration are absolutely key to understanding everything that followed. I setting the scene. The D.C. takeover announcement. So the core of this unfolding story begins on a specific date, August 11th, 2025. Many observers believe this date will be, etched into political memory for some time.
Seems likely.
It was on that day that President Donald Trump made a declaration that, well, many deemed truly unprecedented. He announced a public safety emergency in Washington, D.C. And this wasn't merely a verbal statement or some policy suggestion. No, it was swiftly followed by a direct, actionable presidential order.
Right, an order.
For the federal takeover of the city's entire police force. And as if to underscore the gravity and the immediacy of this, National Guard troops were also simultaneously deployed to the Capitol streets.
A very visible deployment.
From a purely governance perspective, this is a monumental move, isn't it? A direct presidential order essentially seizing control of a sovereign city's primary law enforcement apparatus.
That's precisely the word for it. Monumental. What we saw on August 11th, 2025, was an immense assertion of federal authority, particularly striking because it was directed at a local jurisdiction, even one as, uniquely situated as Washington, D.C.
Right, its status is unique.
It is. But when a president declares a public safety emergency, historically, this type of declaration typically signals an immediate severe threat, something public order, maybe safety, that local authorities are explicitly deemed incapable of handling.
So it implies local failure, essentially.
Yes, or at least an overwhelming situation beyond local capacity. It's designed to unlock extraordinary federal powers, letting the executive branch bypass usual protocols, deploy resources rapidly, or, as in this stark example, exert direct control in ways that would otherwise be, well, legally constrained or politically impractical. The immediate, tangible impact here was just seismic, a shift in the command and control structure for DC's police force.
Overnight, basically.
Pretty much. What had been, moments before, a locally controlled, municipally accountable police department suddenly found itself operating directly under federal direction. This instantly redefined the entire operational landscape, not just for the thousands of DC police officers now reporting up a different chain of command, but critically for the hundreds of thousands of residents they're sworn to protect.
Right, the people living there.
Exactly. It wasn't simply about sending in additional forces to assist. It was about a fundamental restructuring of who held the ultimate reins of law enforcement in the nation's capital. And the practicalities of federalizing a local police force, I mean, they're staggering. It touches on everything from operational protocols to officer training specifics to the thorny issues of accountability.
Who do they answer to now?
Precisely. Accountability to the local community and perhaps most profoundly, the sensitive dynamics of community relations. This move instantly created a new reality on the ground. A reality where the federal government was no longer an oversight body or a partner, but the direct operational commander of the city's streets.
And here's where the narrative, and frankly, the credibility of the official justification, just hits a truly baffling wall. You'd naturally anticipate a public safety emergency being declared when a city is in crisis, right? Maybe reeling from an unprecedented surge in violence, or when social order seems to be genuinely spiraling out of control, demanding immediate, drastic intervention.
That's the usual trigger, yes.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and frankly, quite perplexing for anyone trying to make sense of the official story.
Precisely. This is the pivotal, almost paradoxical point of contention. The one that immediately caused, well, a cascade of red flags for countless observers, journalists, legal scholars, DC residents themselves.
So what was it?
Crucially, at the very moment President Trump declared this dire public safety emergency, official, verifiable reports from highly respected outlets like AP News and JAPIA, The Guardian, unequivocally stated that DC's crime rates were actually at historic lows.
Historic lows. Not just low, but historic lows.
That's what the data showed. According to those reports, this isn't just a minor statistical anomaly or some slight discrepancy. It is a profound, almost jarring contradiction. The stated justification for the federal takeover, this narrative of a dire, immediate public safety emergency, was directly and starkly at odds with the empirical, data-driven reality on the ground.
So if that's the case, what does this startling mismatch suggest about the underlying motivations behind such a drastic and sweeping action?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
When the very reason given for a move of this magnitude simply doesn't align with the objective facts, it doesn't just invite skepticism, it actively demands it. It forces us to question the entire premise.
It absolutely does. And this is the core insight for our deep dive here. This factual inconsistency inevitably fuels intense public skepticism. It compels anyone observing the situation to look far beyond the stated reason for the intervention. When the verifiable data categorically does not support the narrative of an urgent existential emergency, interpretations naturally begin to extend beyond mere, straightforward public safety concerns.
So people start looking for other reasons.
Exactly. It immediately prompts a series of critical questions. Was this truly about an unmanageable crime wave? Or were there perhaps other, less stated, more political objectives secretly at play? What new, often darker narratives begin to emerge when the declared reason for such a monumental action is so starkly disconnected from objective reality? This immediate factual contradiction is arguably the most important element for you, our listener, to grasp. It forms the foundational basis for much of the profound criticism, the widespread public outcry, and the legal challenges that immediately followed. It sets up a fundamental paradox. An emergency was declared where, by all measurable accounts, no such emergency appeared to exist.
The paradox indeed.
This disparity created fertile ground for alternative theories about the administration's true intent. It led many to suspect motives that transcended simple public safety and ventured into the realm of political strategy or maybe executive overreach. The cognitive dissonance for DC residents must have been immense. I mean, one day their mayor might be touting crime reductions. The next, the president declares an emergency based on a problem that statistically just doesn't appear to be there. That paradox is the undeniable core insight.
And that immediate factual contradiction naturally bred suspicion. And suspicion, particularly in Washington, D.C., quickly took to the streets.
It did.
The announcement, as you might wholly expect given what we've just discussed, triggered an almost instantaneous and highly visible reaction from the public.
It did, and with remarkable speed. The very moment the declaration was made public, protests erupted spontaneously right outside the White House itself.
Right there.
Right there. Activists and residents of D.C. wasted absolutely no time voicing their profound opposition. Reports from both AP News and The Guardian highlighted that these protesters were explicitly decrying what they called a move grounded more in politics than public safety.
So they called it out immediately as political.
Immediately. This immediate and unequivocal public response is profoundly significant. It tells us that citizens, right from the absolute outset, perceive this action not as a legitimate, necessary response to an actual public safety crisis, but as something else entirely, something fundamentally driven by political considerations rather than genuine, verifiable public safety needs.
That perception of a purely political act rather than a necessary safety measure, well, speaks volumes, doesn't it? What are the deeper implications when an entire community immediately dismisses an official justification and, with such force, cries foul?
It signifies a deep-seated mistrust, a profound feeling among the populace that their local autonomy is being overridden, perhaps even trampled upon, for reasons that simply do not serve their direct welfare or safety.
A feeling of being imposed upon?
Exactly. When the very community you are ostensibly attempting to serve perceives your intervention as overtly political rather than a legitimate response to public safety, it fundamentally undermines the legitimacy and credibility of the action itself. These early protests weren't just about simple disagreement or, policy debate. They were a clear, resounding statement about a perceived existential threat, a threat to fundamental civil liberties and the cherished principles of local self-governance.
So bigger than just policing policy.
Much better. Residents and activists saw this as a textbook example of executive overreach, a move that brazenly bypassed their own duly elected local officials and, even more egregiously, disregarded the demonstrable factual state of their city. This rapid, pointed, and highly vocal public response powerfully foreshadowed the much deeper, more sustained criticisms that would inevitably follow. It effectively laid the groundwork for widespread accusations of, authoritarianism and targeted political action.
You can almost picture it.
You can't. You can almost viscerally envision the scenes outside the White House. The immediate tension, the hastily unfurled banners, the rhythmic chants, all collectively conveying a clear, unmistakable message that this intervention was decidedly not seen as benign or genuinely necessary, but rather as a hostile takeover, an unwelcome imposition on their community.
So we have this extraordinary declaration, the baffling contradiction of objectively low crime rates, and then immediate, passionate public protests. But the administration wasn't done yet. Their next moves signaled an even deeper, more entrenched commitment to this controversial path, escalating the stakes dramatically.
The story definitely didn't end there.
No. Now let's shift our focus to how this situation began to escalate, specifically regarding the administration's stated future intentions. 2. Escalation and future intentions. Just a short time after the initial takeover, President Trump chose a very public and prominent platform, the Kennedy Center, to make a significant announcement.
A high-profile venue.
Very. It was here that he clearly articulated his intention to seek an extension of federal control over D.C. law enforcement, explicitly pushing beyond the initial 30-day limit that's typically associated with such emergency declarations.
Right, that 30-day window is key.
This particular statement fundamentally signals a clear shift, doesn't it? From a temporary emergency intervention to something much more permanent and sustained.
It absolutely does. And the significance of that standard 30-day limit cannot be overstated in understanding this escalation. Emergency declarations, by their very nature and design, are unequivocally meant to be temporary.
Short-term fixes.
Exactly. Immediate responses to acute, time-limited crises. They are specifically designed to provide a narrow, limited window for federal intervention to stabilize a situation that has spiraled beyond local control. The desire, openly expressed, to extend this federal control beyond that initial, conventionally understood 30-day period immediately and profoundly implies a shift from a reactive short-term emergency response to a much more sustained, deliberate, and frankly, long-term intervention.
Suggesting a bigger plan.
It strongly suggests a broader, more ambitious vision for D.C., one where the federal government seeks to maintain direct, prolonged, perhaps even indefinite oversight of its law enforcement.
And what are the potential mechanisms for such an extension? And what sort of precedent might this move ultimately set for federal-local relations across the nation?
Well, a formal, indefinite extension of such federal control would most likely require some form of legislative action from Congress.
Congress would have to approve it.
Ideally, yes. Or the president would have to heavily lean on a highly expansive and almost certainly contested interpretation of his existing emergency powers, which, as we'll discuss shortly, ties directly into his subsequent public warnings. For those dedicated to advocating for D.C. autonomy or indeed full statehood, this move, publicly declared at a high-profile venue like the Kennedy Center, is nothing short of a profound affront.
A major setback for them.
A significant, potentially crippling setback for the city's long-held aspirations for genuine self-governance. It powerfully reinforces a perception that D.C. remains a mere federal ward, rather than a self-determining independent entity. The very public nature of this statement, delivered from such a prominent stage, further underscored the sheer deliberateness and unvarnished seriousness of this escalated intent. It left virtually no doubt about the administration's long-term ambitions for the capital's policing.
So not just a temporary fix.
No, this wasn't a casual, off-the-cuff remark. It was a clear, premeditated declaration of much larger purpose, signaling a determined move towards entrenching federal control rather than simply implementing a temporary solution to a transient problem.
And as if that wasn't stark enough, during that very same Kennedy Center event, President Trump didn't just state his intention for an extension. He issued a direct, undeniable warning to the legislative branch.
This is another major escalation.
He explicitly stated for all to hear that he would declare a national emergency if Congress failed to pass what he termed enabling legislation to support the continued federal control.
A national emergency. That's serious language.
It is. This isn't just a request or even a strong suggestion. It sounds very much like a direct threat, doesn't it?
It is unambiguously a threat, and one that immediately raises profound existential constitutional questions about the delicate balance of power between the executive and legislative branches.
That separation of powers.
Exactly. A national emergency is indeed a very broad and powerful concept under U.S. law, enshrined in the National Emergencies Act, which grants presidents immense powers. This act has historically been invoked for a wide range of crises, natural disasters like hurricanes, economic downturns, even foreign policy challenges.
Right, things affecting the whole country.
Usually. Yeah. However, for a president to threaten to declare one, specifically because Congress has failed to pass legislation he desires for a local domestic issue, especially one where the very existence of the underlying emergency is so hotly disputed by empirical data, is highly unusual.
Problematic, even.
Deeply problematic and constitutionally precarious. It implies a clear willingness to effectively bypass Congress entirely through unilateral executive action if his legislative demands are not met, thereby fundamentally sidelining the entire legislative process, which is, the very heart of democratic lawmaking.
So if a president were to act on such a threat and bypass Congress in this manner, what are the broader implications for the functioning of our democracy? What does it mean for the separation of powers?
Oh, the constitutional implications are immense and potentially far-reaching. This move, or even just the threat of it, could be viewed by all three branches of government, and certainly by constitutional scholars, as a significant, perhaps even dangerous, overreach of executive power.
Setting a bad precedent.
Potentially setting a perilous precedent for future presidents. It directly challenges the fundamental principle of separation of powers, a cornerstone of our democracy, where Congress is explicitly responsible for crafting and passing laws, and the executive is responsible for faithfully enforcing them. When the executive branch implicitly, or in this case, explicitly, threatens to act unilaterally and independently, if the legislative branch does not comply with its demands, it creates a coercive and highly imbalanced dynamic, one that can, over time, dangerously erode democratic checks and balances.
Undermining Congress's role.
Completely. The direct, almost blunt nature of this warning underscores the extremely high stakes involved in this standoff. It revealed a clear executive intent to exert dominance, not just over D.C. law enforcement, but over the entire legislative process itself. It was a very clear, almost unvarnished signal that the administration intended to get its way by hook or by crook, regardless of congressional resistance or constitutional norms. This kind of executive assertion, especially when divorced from a clear and undisputed emergency, risks warping the very framework of our governance.
And while this high-stakes political rhetoric and these profound constitutional warnings were unfolding in public, the tangible, physical manifestation of this federal takeover was simultaneously becoming increasingly visible on the very streets of Washington, D.C.
Yes, the reality on the ground was changing.
The Capitol was changing before its residents' eyes.
Indeed. Around the same time as these public statements from the Kennedy Center, the tangible impact of the federal order began to solidify and become undeniable. Roughly 800 National Guard troops, a significant uniformed presence, were visibly deployed and began actively patrolling D.C. streets.
800 troops.
Roughly, yes. And critically, they were operating not under local MPD command, but directly under federal authority, as reported vividly by The Guardian. This visible, uniform deployment had an immediate and profoundly transformative impact on the urban landscape, and, perhaps even more significantly, on the daily lives and psychological well-being of D.C. residents. Well, the sight of uniformed National Guard troops, images often associated with war zones, natural disaster relief, or severe civil unrest, suddenly patrolling familiar civilian streets and iconic landmarks, fundamentally altered the entire atmosphere of the Capitol.
So how does the pervasive presence of these troops, this very visible symbol of federal power, affect residents' day-to-day perception of their city, and perhaps even their own sense of safety or freedom?
It creates a profoundly complex and often unsettling shift. For a very small segment, perhaps those who felt a strong, albeit statistically unsupported, perceived lack of order, it might have evoked a temporary sense of heightened security. Maybe.
For most people.
But for the vast majority of residents, particularly those accustomed to a democratic society, it undoubtedly fostered a pervasive feeling of unease, constant surveillance perhaps, and a tangible loss of personal liberty. The sheer presence of military personnel in civilian public spaces can be inherently intimidating. It can dramatically change the nature of everyday public interactions.
Changes how you go about your day.
Absolutely. It fundamentally shifts the perception from a community where local police are accountable directly to the residents they serve to one where an external, federally controlled, and inherently more militarized force is present and operating with a different mandate. This can lead to increased anxiety, maybe a chilling effect on public gatherings and free speech, and a deep-seated questioning of the true motivations behind such a pervasive federal presence. Especially when, as we've meticulously discussed, the city's crime rates were demonstrably at historic lows.
It changes the whole feel of the city.
It literally changes the look, the feel, and the social dynamics of navigating the city. It raises unsettling questions about where residents can go freely, how they can gather, and what their fundamental rights are in the face of this new federally commanded authority. The very fabric of public life shifts when the instruments of national defense are deployed as instruments of domestic policing, especially in what was, statistically, a peaceful environment.
So we've meticulously laid out the facts of the takeover, explored the surprising and contradictory context, detailed the immediate and passionate public reaction, and then traced the administration's escalating intentions for the future.
A lot to unpack already.
Definitely. Now let's truly dive deeper into the various perspectives, the often clashing interpretations, and the strong accusations that immediately emerged from this incredibly complex and contentious situation. 3. Diving deeper. Perspectives and interpretations. Almost immediately following the announcement, critics from across the political spectrum, perhaps surprisingly, coalesced around a very strong, very specific characterization of President Trump's move. The Daily Beast, among other publications, reported that they quickly and emphatically labeled it authoritarian.
That's a heavy word.
It really is. That's not a word that's thrown around lightly in democratic discourse, is it? It carries significant weight.
It absolutely is, and it's a label that carries profound historical and political weight. It immediately implies a significant deviation from established democratic norms and a dangerous concentration of power within the executive branch. In this specific context, the label authoritarian refers to several key interconnected aspects of the federal takeover that we've already touched upon.
Such as?
Firstly, the declaration of an emergency despite demonstrably low crime rates. That suggested an arbitrary, almost manufactured exercise of power, where the stated justification appeared to be created to fit the desired action, rather than being fact-based or genuinely necessary.
Working backwards from the conclusion.
It certainly looked that way to critics.
Yeah.
Secondly, the blatant bypassing of local authority, effectively stripping D.C.'s duly elected officials of their legitimate control over their own police force, was widely seen as a direct affront to local self-governance and the fundamental principles of democratic representation. D.C. already faces unique and long-standing challenges regarding its lack of full statehood and its peculiar status.
Right, the taxation without representation issue.
Exactly. And this particular action exacerbated those pre-existing concerns exponentially.
And then, as we discussed, there was the direct threat to Congress. That, in itself, seems like a significant pillar of the authoritarian critique.
Exactly. The explicit public threat to declare a national emergency if Congress failed to pass enabling legislation was widely viewed as a clear attempt to coerce the legislative branch.
Like holding them hostage.
Essentially, yes. Holding it hostage to the executive's demands and thus fundamentally undermining the separation of powers and the constitutional process itself. When you combine these elements, a declared emergency contradicted by data, the bypassing of local democratic authority, and a direct threat to circumvent Congress, critics saw a very clear pattern.
Disturbing pattern.
All these combined elements painted a stark picture for critics of a leader willing to centralize power, to disregard established checks and balances, and to impose his will through unilateral executive action, even when faced with contradictory evidence and institutional resistance. The implications of such a characterization for democratic norms and fundamental civil liberties are profound. It suggests a potential erosion of the core principles that underpin a liberal democracy, where power is meant to be diffused, accountable, and subject to rigorous oversight.
Raises fundamental questions.
It forces us to consider how easily executive power can expand and even distort, especially when justifications are questionable and opposition is treated as an impediment rather than a legitimate democratic voice. This wasn't merely framed as a policy disagreement. For many, it was perceived and explicitly articulated as a fundamental challenge to the democratic system itself. Critics were drawing parallels, implicitly or explicitly, to historical instances of executive overreach or the slow, insidious decline of democratic institutions, highlighting a deep, visceral concern that this action represented a dangerous and deeply unsettling precedent. A key hallmark, a litmus test, you might say, of an authoritarian move isn't just power being asserted, but power asserted without clear, verifiable justification and without the usual democratic checks.
And critics saw both here.
Here, we saw both, according to the critics, a declared emergency contradicted by data and a threat to bypass Congress. That's the authoritarian red flag, waving conspicuously in their view.
And to truly understand why critics felt compelled to use such a strong and loaded label, we need to thoroughly unpack the specific facets of their critique. The Daily Beast, in its incisive analysis, notably outlined three very distinct but interconnected key concerns.
Right.
The militarization of D.C., targeting of marginalized communities, and political motivations underlying the federal action. Let's take the time to break down each of these pillars of criticism.
These three pillars, as you say, form the undeniable bedrock of the critics' comprehensive argument against the takeover. They provide the substance behind that authoritarian label. Let's start with the militarization of D.C.
Okay.
This concept extends far beyond just the mere visual presence of National Guard troops on city streets. It implies a fundamental and potentially dangerous shift in the very approach to policing within a civilian population. Traditional community-oriented policing, which, has been the focus of reform efforts in many cities, explicitly emphasizes building trust with residents, employing de-escalation techniques.
Working with the community.
Precisely. And developing a nuanced understanding of local community needs and dynamics. Militarization, on the other hand, often involves deploying military-grade equipment, think armored vehicles, advanced weaponry, adopting tactics originally designed for combat or foreign counterinsurgency.
Things meant for war zones.
Essentially. And a subtle but significant shift in perception. The populace can be viewed more as an adversary to be controlled than as a community to be served and protected. When uniformed troops, trained for conflict, are patrolling streets, there's an inherent heightened sense of potential confrontation for ordinary citizens. The crucial lines between civilian life and military operation become profoundly blurred.
Which has consequences.
Deeply unsettling implications for how crowd control is handled during protests, for everyday citizen interactions with law enforcement, and for preserving fundamental civil liberties. Military forces are generally not trained for domestic policing and typically operate under entirely different rules of engagement than civilian police. Their presence alone can create an atmosphere of occupation rather than protection.
That distinction between police and military roles is critical, and it immediately raises profound concerns about how different communities, especially vulnerable ones, might be disproportionately affected.
Which brings us directly to the second powerful pillar of critique, the targeting of marginalized communities. D.C. is a city with a rich, complex history and a vibrant, diverse demographic makeup. including a significant black population. Historically and tragically, marginalized communities in the United States have disproportionately borne the brunt of aggressive, often overzealous policing tactics.
A painful history there.
Very much so. When a federal takeover is widely perceived as politically motivated rather than genuinely aimed at reducing crime, there is an immediate and heightened fear that these specific communities will be unfairly singled out. Singled out for increased surveillance, more frequent stops, a higher likelihood of arrests, regardless of actual criminal activity.
Fear based on past experience.
Absolutely. This deeply held concern is firmly rooted in historical precedents of systemic overpolicing in minority neighborhoods and the very real potential for a federally controlled force to act with demonstrably less accountability to the local community it purports to serve. It taps into deeply ingrained fears about civil rights abuses, the suppression of dissent, and the profound erosion of trust between law enforcement agencies and the communities they are constitutionally meant to serve and protect. The memory of past injustices, whether recent or distant, looms large here.
And finally, the overarching theme we've consistently touched on throughout our discussion, the one that seems to tie all these criticisms together, the political motivations behind the entire federal action.
Yes, this is perhaps the most encompassing and potent criticism, and it's the one that reiterates and powerfully expands on that initial public reaction that the entire move was grounded more in politics than public safety.
And the crime data feeds into this.
Exactly. The stark, undeniable contradiction between the administration's declared emergency and D.C.'s objectively verified historic low crime rates provides concrete empirical evidence that powerfully bolsters this argument. Critics posited that the administration's primary objectives were less about an actual raging crime wave and far more about projecting a specific, highly visible image of law and order.
For political gain.
Potentially, yes. To rally a political base, perhaps, to dominate a news cycle, or to simply exert direct, unchecked control over a city that is overwhelmingly democratic in its voting patterns. This could involve, as critics suggested, using D.C. as a testing ground for broader federal interventions in other cities across the country, or simply as a symbolic, dramatic display of unvarnished executive power.
The potential impact on trust is huge.
These specific criticisms, if widely accepted by the public, could severely impact public trust, not only in the specific law enforcement agencies involved, but also in federal institutions themselves, both within D.C. and potentially across the entire nation. By creating a perception that the government's actions are driven by partisan gain, by a desire for control, rather than by an honest pursuit of public good or genuine safety. Giving voice to these concerns by elaborating on each criticism helps you, our listener, to understand the deeply felt why behind the fears and accusations. It paints a much fuller, more nuanced picture of the opposition's viewpoint and the stakes involved.
So on one side, you have this incredibly detailed, multifaceted critique, labeling the entire action as fundamentally authoritarian and politically driven, complete with specific, articulated fears.
A very strong case laid out by critics.
But then on the other side, you have the administration's stated rationale, a much simpler, far more straightforward, almost monolithic explanation.
Indeed. In direct and stark opposition to the detailed, multifaceted criticisms, President Trump consistently and repeatedly emphasized his singular stated intent to restore safety and order in the Capitol.
Just safety and order.
That phrase served as the administration's unwavering counter-narrative, presenting the federal takeover as a necessary, even benevolent intervention, explicitly aimed at addressing a perceived rather than statistically verifiable problem. The administration's definition of safety and order in this context appears to differ quite significantly from that of critics or the general public, who might define it more broadly. In terms of community well-being, mutual trust between citizens and authorities, and objectively low crime rates.
So a different definition entirely.
It seems so. For the administration, safety and order seem to encompass a much broader vision of visible federal control and decisive authority, perhaps implying a strategic need to project an image of strength, unflinching resolve, and immediate action, irrespective of the underlying contradictory crime statistics.
So in this narrative, it's less about actual, measurable crime reduction and more about a display of control, a projection of power. Would that be a fair assessment of how critics saw it?
That's certainly how critics interpreted it, and for good reason based on the points they raised. This narrative attempts to justify the sheer scale and intrusive nature of the intervention, despite the low crime rates, by fundamentally reframing the problem itself. It implicitly suggests that even if statistics are objectively low, there's a nebulous feeling of disorder, or a potential for it, maybe a simmering unrest, that only a forceful, overt federal presence can rectify.
A feeling, not necessarily a fact.
Right. This framing allows the administration to claim success, not necessarily in reducing crime that isn't rampant, but in imposing a perceived order, in reassuring a specific segment of the population that something is being done. These two vastly different and fundamentally opposed narratives, one emphasizing authoritarianism, political motives, and stark factual contradictions, the other focusing on restoring a broad, almost abstract sense of order and safety, compete fiercely for public perception and understanding.
A real clash of narratives.
Totally. The administration's narrative positions this action as the decisive solution to a problem that, by objective data, might not have existed in the way it was initially framed, thereby creating a significant, almost bewildering disconnect that the public must grapple with. It is, at its heart, a profound clash of fundamental interpretations of reality, of governmental responsibility, and of who gets to define the terms of public discourse. As this dynamic of competing realities becomes its own form of political theater, forcing citizens to actively choose which version of events resonates more truthfully.
It truly is. And this clash of interpretations, this fundamental disagreement on what's genuinely happening on the ground, leads us directly to the broader implications and the very pressing, unanswered questions this event raises for everyone, not just those immediately impacted in Washington, D.C.
Yes, the ripple spread far beyond the Beltway.
These questions reverberate far beyond the Capitol. 4. Implications and unanswered questions. This event, the federal takeover of D.C. law enforcement, truly showcases a significant and, by any measure, quite rare exercise of federal executive power over a local jurisdiction.
Extremely rare in this manner.
It's not just about the discrete actions that occurred. It's profoundly about what it signifies for the delicate and evolving balance of power within our intricate system of governance.
Absolutely. The immediate legal and operational implications of such a direct takeover on a city's police force are, to put it mildly, profound and far-reaching. It fundamentally and dramatically alters the typical, long-established balance between federal and local governance that underpins our federalist system.
That federal-local balance is key.
It is. Normally, local police forces operate squarely under the authority of elected municipal leaders, making them directly accountable to their city's residents. A federal takeover, even in the admittedly unique context of D.C., means that this crucial chain of accountability is instantly and irrevocably shifted.
Accountability shifts upwards.
Completely. Decisions about policing strategy, about how resources are allocated, even about the nuances of daily operational procedures are no longer made by those directly accountable to the city's populace through the ballot box. Instead, they're made by federal officials whose priorities may not align with and whose accountability is not directly tied to the immediate needs or values of the local community. This can create a significant, even dangerous disconnect, where the imperatives of the federal government, driven perhaps by national political optics or broader agendas, may fundamentally diverge from the ground-level needs and desires of the people living in the city.
The natural question that arises then is, could this specific action, given its precedent-setting nature, open the door for future federal interventions in other cities? Regardless of their unique jurisdictional status. Is D.C. just the first step?
This is a critical, indeed pressing question that deeply concerns many constitutional scholars and advocates for local autonomy.
I can see why.
While D.C. does possess a distinct and peculiar status as the federal capital, this action could, without a doubt, be viewed by future administrations as a template, or at the very least a significant precedent for future federal interventions. Consider the stark contrast. Previous federal assistance to cities, whether for natural disasters or specific criminal investigations, almost invariably involves local authorities requesting or actively collaborating with federal agencies.
Usually it's invited.
Exactly. This D.C. takeover, however, was a direct, unilateral, and entirely unrequested federal imposition on core city functions. This could very well embolden future administrations to consider similar unrequested interventions in other municipalities, particularly those with differing political leanings from the White House, or those perceived, rightly or wrongly, to have issues that fit a particular federal narrative, regardless of whether those cities are federal districts or full-fledged state municipalities.
That's a chilling thought for mayors across the country.
It is. The long-term implications for the cherished concept of local control and autonomy across the entire nation are, frankly, concerning. It powerfully suggests a potential erosion of the foundational idea that cities and states have primary sovereign authority over their own local governance. It effectively opens the door for more frequent, more forceful, and less accountable federal intrusions into matters traditionally handled at the local level. This fundamentally challenges the principle of federalism, where power is ideally shared in balance between national and local governments, fostering a system where local needs and preferences can be democratically expressed and addressed. It's potentially a redefinition of who holds the reins of power in America.
And this leads us directly into a broader, arguably even more critical discussion about the very nature of emergency powers themselves and their relationship to the established norms of our democratic system. This DC situation feels like a stark case study.
It absolutely does. This deep dive has powerfully highlighted the inherent, almost perpetual tension between the executive branch's often expansive use of broad emergency powers and the established foundational norms of democratic processes. In a robust, healthy democracy, legislative oversight, the rule of law, and local self-governance are not merely optional features. They are fundamental checks on executive authority.
They're essential.
Essential. The D.C. takeover, especially underscored by the president's explicit threat to declare a national emergency if Congress didn't comply, starkly illustrates this tension in real time. This isn't just about a policy disagreement over policing tactics. It's about the very mechanisms of power and accountability within our system. When an executive can declare an emergency based on objectively disputed facts and then attempt to coerce or bypass another co-equal branch of government to achieve its aims, well, it raises fundamental questions about the resilience and integrity of our democratic checks and balances.
What are the long-term consequences of such assertive uses of executive emergency powers? Particularly when the stated justification is so openly disputed and contradicted by facts, where does that lead us?
The long-term consequences could be a gradual but ultimately significant erosion of legislative power and local autonomy, and a concentration of power within the executive branch that was never intended by the framers of the Constitution.
A shift in the balance.
A major shift. If presidents can routinely bypass Congress or effectively coerce it through threats of unilateral executive action, the legislative process becomes less meaningful, less deliberative. The crucial balance of power shifts dramatically and perhaps irreversibly towards the executive. This could lead to a perilous precedent where future administrations feel empowered to declare emergencies for an ever wider range of issues, even when objective data doesn't support the claims, thereby expanding executive authority at the expense of democratic deliberation, the legislative process, and local self-determination.
Weakening the system overall.
It fundamentally reshapes democratic checks and balances by weakening the very institutions designed to provide oversight and accountability to the executive. It challenges the foundational principle that power in a democracy should be distributed, subject to transparent scrutiny, and derived from the consent of the governed, not concentrated unilaterally and imposed from the top down. Connecting back to the warning given to Congress, this entire situation frames it as a direct and undeniable challenge to the legislative branch's essential role and inherent authority in our system of government. It's a powerful and potentially dangerous redefinition of executive prerogative.
So we've meticulously covered the facts, explored the sharply differing perspectives, and delved into the profound implications. But now, let's bring it full circle, back to you, our listener. Why does this event, which literally happened in the heart of Washington, D.C., matter so directly and so personally to you?
It matters immensely because while this specific event played out in the unique crucible of the nation's capital, the fundamental themes it raises are universal. They're directly applicable to any democratic society anywhere in the world.
Not just a D.C. story.
Not at all. This isn't just a localized D.C. story. It's profoundly about the ever-present, often uncomfortable, tension between the imperative for collective security and the foundational principles of individual liberty. It's about the delicate, constantly negotiated balance of power between different levels of government, federal, state, and local, and how easily that intricate balance can be disrupted, shifted, or even overtly challenged. Most importantly, it powerfully underscores the critical, almost indispensable importance of critical thinking.
Essential for citizens.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It challenges you to employ that skill rigorously when you're presented with conflicting accounts of reality, particularly when those accounts originate from official sources versus independent reporting or what is demonstrably observable with your own eyes. It forces you to ask, what truly constitutes an emergency and who gets to decide?
It truly forces you to weigh evidence, to scrutinize narratives. So, to invite your own deeper reflection, What does this particular deep dive make you personally consider about the fundamental relationship between the federal government and local communities across your own nation?
Hmm.
How do you weigh stated intentions, particularly from powerful figures, against the immediate public reaction and the cold, hard, empirical data when that information is conflicting?
Think about how information is framed. Who is framing it, and what underlying motivations or political objectives might truly be at play behind the pronouncements? As a citizen, how do you prioritize? Do you prioritize a perceived, even a statistically unsupported sense of order or control, even if it comes at the potential cost of local autonomy, fundamental civil liberties, or democratic
With
accountability?
alternative.
Or do you, conversely, place a higher value on local self-determination, on the accountability of your own duly elected local officials, even when those communities face challenging or complex situations? These are not easy questions. They are, in fact, incredibly complex and often uncomfortable dilemmas. But this deep dive, with its stark contradictions, its clear assertion of power, and its powerful implications, compels us, and indeed you, to confront them directly.
Makes you think.
It encourages you to apply the analytical skills we've practiced today, the sifting of evidence, the questioning of narratives, the pursuit of deeper context, to your own understanding of current events, pushing you far beyond the headlines to truly grasp the deeper dynamics at play in our ever-evolving political landscape.
And that, listeners, brings us to the close of this truly thought-provoking and, we hope, illuminating deep dive. We've meticulously explored the core tension inherent in a federal assertion of power in Washington, D.C., an action justified by a public safety emergency despite compelling objective evidence of historic low crime rates.
The central paradox.
Exactly. We've witnessed how this bold action generated immediate, palpable, and profoundly strong public and critical reactions, leading to it being labeled by many as an authoritarian and politically motivated maneuver. And we've dissected how it carried significant long-term implications for future escalations of executive power and the very fabric of our federalist system.
And as you reflect on all of this, consider this final provocative thought that we hope stays with you long after our discussion ends. Considering the diverse perspectives, the stark factual contradictions, and the profound implications we've just unpacked, what does the DC takeover ultimately tell us about the evolving definition of public safety in a deeply politically charged environment, especially when official data tells a demonstrably different story than the one being asserted by those in power?
A crucial question.
How do democratic societies like ours fundamentally reconcile the imperative for security with the foundational principles of local autonomy and robust democratic oversight when those two vital things appear to be so starkly at odds?
Something to ponder deeply indeed. We truly hope this deep dive has provided you with crucial clarity and invaluable context on this pivotal and profoundly impactful event. Thank you for joining us on Global Politics today.